Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay? Not yet? Oh, there we go. Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon. Um, so we just saw the clip for Time and Water, um, and I'm really happy to see so many people gathered here today. My name is Craig Campbell. I'm a professor of anthropology at UT Austin, and an old friend of two of the guests here, Dominic and Cymene, who are both professors at Rice University. I'll give you an introduction to our panel and a little synopsis of the film, although you've seen it already. This synopsis has some sort of carefully crafted language and words, which is actually really significant for the conversation tonight, which is about storytelling and thinking about how we talk about and think about and approach the Anthropocene, how we approach climate change. Okay, so first of all, I want to introduce Sarah Dosa, the director, writer, and producer of this film in the center. Uh, we also have Cymene Howe to my left, who's a professor of anthropology and co-founder of the Science and Technology Studies program at Rice University. She's published a whole bunch of great books and things, which I won't go into. Look her up; it's great. And Dominic Boyer, professor and co-director of the Central for Coastal Futures and Adaptive Resilience at Rice University, also author of many great books, and also both filmmakers too. Okay, so let me just begin with the synopsis. Maybe some of you are familiar with this, but again, really pay attention to the language of this. It really matters. So, renowned Icelandic poet and author Andri Snær Magnusson is chasing something elusive. As the glacial ice of his homeland melts, he constructs a cinematic time capsule to hold onto this moment and send it to the future before everything he loves slips away. Using his own collected archives, his grandparents' photographs, and films, as well as traditional songs and folk tales, Andri interlaces his family's story with that of the land around him. From Academy Award nominated director Sarah Dosa, Time and Water is a universal reflection on the power of home and what it means to be alive amid profound epochal change. So, the conversation today is about the power of storytelling. It's about family connection, and it's about uncertainty of the future. Let me begin. And by the way, I'll pose a couple questions to our panelists and to the panelists. If there's anything you want to add, especially to your biography that you think is pertinent, please do. But because we've got the director here, let me start with the director. Um, it's a really simple question. I just watched the film yesterday, by the way. I'm super excited about it, and I've got lots of my own thoughts. I'm trying to hold those back because I'm interested in hearing what you have to say. So first of all, how did the film happen? How tell us the story, get us there. Everyone's just seen the trailer or a bit of a clip from it.
Uh, Um, it's funny thinking about how did the film happen, especially when it's now out in the world. I feel like the film happened in so many different ways. It was a deeply collaborative process, but kind of the origins of the film come from meeting Andri Snær Magnusson when I actually worked on another film in Iceland in 2019. That film is called The Seer and the Unseen, and it tells the story of an Icelandic seer, a person who is in communication with spirits of nature in Iceland. Um, she was part of an environmental movement, and Andri was one of the leaders of that. And when I was working on that film, everyone said, "You must meet Andri Snær Magnusson." I did, and I very quickly saw why they wanted me to be in touch with him. Andri is a public intellectual. He's a poet. He's a writer. He is a leader. He was even enlisted by many Icelanders to run for president in Iceland. All to say, he's very beloved. And he quickly became one of my own favorite writers. He was in he consulted on that film, and I kind of tracked him ever since that film came out. Years later, I read an article that he published that was entitled "How Do You Say Goodbye to a Glacier?" And it was about the funeral for Okiokos, which Cymene and Dominic organized and led, which I'll let them speak much more about. But I was both devastated and inspired by this question that he posed. How do you say goodbye to a glacier? In this moment of the Anthropocene, when so many people are wordlessly grieving something that they can't quite put language around, like the death of landscape, I thought that he was someone who is so articulate and could so he really spoke about his grandparents within kind of the natural landscapes, and he was able to weave this very human story, amid kind of the landscapes that, we were seeing disappear. So all to say there is a very inspiring kind of seed in that article that kind of, caused me to reach out. We restarted some conversations we had been having long ago, and many years later, this film there's a lot of twists and turns. I'm trying to edit it in my head, but that was really the kernel of the beginnings of the film.
That's great. Thank you. Um, I think for a lot of us here, maybe the experience of actually being on a glacier is novel. And I think it maybe would be useful to set the scene a little bit. We saw the film just now, or a clip of it, but can we maybe open that up a little bit? I don't know if Dominic or Cymene, do you want to talk a little bit about?
Yeah, thank you, Craig. So it's sort of about the experience of being on a glacier. I mean, one of the things that we've realized in doing this research is that most human beings on Earth will never encounter a glacier, will never spend time with a glacier, will never see it up close, will never get to experience the particular smell and odor that a glacier creates. This kind of almost like a very irony, sort of mineral like smell that it emits as it's melting. And also the sounds that a glacier makes, which are really particular, sort of crackling and singing. And in the Arctic, they had an expression in the 19th century for the sound of sea ice, and they called it the Devil's Symphony. And so the Devil's Symphony was the sound of ice sort of coming into contact with other bits of ice. And as we're thinking about these changes to the ecosystem, to our environments, to our entire worlds, I think it's important to recognize that these experiences are also disappearing, but that they don't have to. That we have it within our powers to actually preserve these glaciers, to keep them moving, to keep them singing, to keep them making their smells, and moving across the landscape, which is one of the qualities of being a glacier, is being able to move. And one of the things we learned from glaciologists is that when a glacier stops moving, when it stops moving under its own weight, then it becomes dead ice. And that's what the glaciologists call it, dead ice. And so that's, I think, both a metaphor and a scientific term that's really telling.
Just, I'm glad you ended up there. That was a really resonant part of the film, which, by the way, if folks don't know, is playing tomorrow, 11 a.m. at AFS, Austin Film Society. I really, really recommend you go and check it out. But let's dig a little bit more into storytelling, and this is what this panel's about. We're trying to think about what exactly is storytelling about. How does it work? How do we want it to work? How do we expect it to work? I think one of the first ways we can get in there is starting to think a little bit about genre. And so this is a question for you, Dominic. Is can you talk a little bit more about storytelling and the ways in which you feel that genre matters?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you all for coming. It's great to be here. So we've experimented with a few different genres in terms of thinking about how can you help sort of focus attention on urgent issues. Climate change is one of them, but the world is full of urgent issues right now. All sorts of things are in a state of transition. And when something's very urgent and you really want to pay attention to it, there's a sense you want to shout, you want to say, pay attention to this. You're crazy to not pay attention to this. And you realize, and I think all of us can speak to this through our own experiences, that sometimes that like nail on the head approach to telling a story is not always the most effective way to bring people in who may not be aware of the details of the issues, who may have, be hearing complex information and they're not sure, really what to think about something. And one of the things that we found is most helpful is to try to meet the world halfway and to try to find a human side to this, an emotional side to it. And you can do that through different ways, right? There are different genres, as you're saying, Craig, that can be effective. You can do it through drama. Maybe drama makes the most sense for something like climate change. But actually, when we made our documentary film, a little tiny, a very, very independent, very lo-fi film about the loss of this first Icelandic glacier, we actually were working with a team of creatives who came from comedy. They came from like shaky hand cam, office style, sort of verite comedy. And that actually it seems like a strange choice, but in a way it did open up a chance to look at this to maybe a wider emotional bandwidth than simply fear, concern, shame, grief, anxiety, to maybe find what's also ridiculous in the situation, or what actually could be joyful, even in the act of coming together to grieve. We organized a funeral for a glacier, but it wasn't a really dour, despondent moment. It was more like an Irish wake. People were happy, and they were happy because they were with other people who cared about the loss of a glacier, and that creates community that's incredibly important. So, genre does definitely matter, but also sort of finding that human touch, I think, to the approach, which is something Time and Water does extraordinarily well.
Yeah, absolutely, that's great. I mean, if we follow that thread a little bit further, this we were talking in the green room a little bit about this already. I was thinking about how in climate work, it's often, at least when it gets mediatized, it gets framed for us as a struggle between despair and hope. We're constantly asked to end things on a hopeful note, right? Well, what does that mean exactly? And what really struck me in watching this film is the way that it turns all of that on its head and it asks us to think about different things. I think is absolutely central to the ways that we think about storytelling, or we're being asked to think about storytelling. So, Sarah, to you, can you elaborate a little bit on your thinking and maybe your relationship to some of the dominant ways that this kind of storytelling is happening?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question, and I think I'll constantly be coming up with new answers to it. But for us, in making a film about glaciers, we couldn't help but really think about kind of the iconography of glaciers in the media. And a very common trope of glaciers is the shot of the Cavan Glacier to signal kind of the collapse of the world, so to speak. It's very effective. It's devastating. It's thunderous. It does kind of say apocalypse. Um, we are in dire times. There's no debating that. I have tremendous empathy for the feeling that the world is ending. And at the same time, if that becomes how we know a glacier in a moment of collapse, then we're bypassing the life force that it contains. And that's something that for us, when making Time and Water, was so important. In order to care about a glacier, in order to understand the urgency of a glacier's death, you have to feel a glacier's life and the myriad cultural meanings that humans kind of engage with as well when it comes to glaciers. Um, so that was one guiding principle, is not to overly focus on kind of the collapse imagery, the doom, but to find something more nuanced, to engage perhaps with that image, but to find something else. For us, we didn't want the film to be in this dichotomy of hope and despair for a few reasons. Um, Hope, while it certainly feels good and is necessary, can sometimes lead to this feeling that, okay, if we have so much hope, other people are going to take care of this problem. We don't have to engage ourselves. Um, if there's too much doom, if there's too much dread, if it feels like it's already a foregone conclusion that the climate crisis is going to completely, cause apocalypse throughout the world, then it also stymies engagement because there's nothing to be done. However, there's a space of uncertainty that I think can really invite participation. If you feel like the future is not yet written, you can then be part of writing that future yourself. And so it's that kind of, we really talked about it as agentive uncertainty was the target we were trying to hit. So it was quite difficult, and I think a lot of different people take away different pieces from the film themselves. But we hope that that spaciousness can allow people to fill in their own experiences rather than be told something within this kind of dichotomous paradigm.
Wow, that's great. And for those of you who didn't hear that, I think you said agent of uncertainty. That's absolutely lovely. I don't know, Dominic or Cymene, do you want to riff on this a little bit in terms of hope and agent of uncertainty?
I mean, I love the term agentive uncertainty because it gives us the sense that we have the capacity to make changes and to be transformational in the acts that we do, in the behaviors that we undertake, in the communication that we share with people, both our families, our larger communities, our kind of concentric circles of communication and life that we move through, but also understanding that the future is not yet written. There's a very famous anthropologist called Marshall Solins who actually Dominic studied with and who I'm sure you know of too. And Marshall was very fond of sort of recapping a phrase. And that was that he said that the problem with the future is that it's empty. So this empty future is both, I think, on the one hand, can be very terrifying, what's going to happen within that space of uncertainty. But it's also an invitation to potential, to all kinds of opportunity to make these positive changes. And so an empty future can be, we can sort of adorn that however we want. And we do have these choices. And as an apex species, as much as we've screwed that up in a lot of ways, we also have the opportunity to turn things around. So I love this concept. It's like it crosses over, it's like so conceptual, so intellectual, but it's also got a lot of feeling in it. So a gent of uncertainty.
So us nerding out over this term is largely to do because we're all anthropologists at the table here, including Sarah, who got an MA as well in anthropology. Is it
I
BA?
do, yeah. I thought I was going to be a professor of anthropology for most
Right.
of my life. My mother, she's a retired professor of anthropology. So I'm really excited and honored to be speaking with you, anthropologists, right now.
Well, it's great to be schooled by you with this film as well, which is really attentive to the everyday in ways that is kind of the bread and butter for cultural anthropologists. Um, Cymene, would you elaborate a little bit on some of the ways you're thinking about anthropology in context of this film?
Yeah, I mean, as Dominic mentioned with the funeral that we hosted for Okyokot, which is basically translates to okay glacier because it's spelled okay. So it looks like the English word okay, but in Icelandic it's pronounced ok, sort of like the bird, the great ok. And in Icelandic, that's actually a funny name, ok. People like Icelanders laugh about the name Okyokot, and Yokot means glacier. In the creation of that ceremony, we realized that one of the important things around that was the use of ritual. And as cultural anthropologists, this is something that we learn basically from day one, right? The importance of ritual. And so recognizing that, I think, helped us to be able to communicate better the stakes at hand with Okyokot. And ritual is something that all human communities recognize and have in different ways. The other thing that all human communities have are mortuary rituals or rituals for the dead, ways of recognizing the deceased, the human deceased. And in every place on earth, they take different forms, they have different liturgy, they have different practices, different sort of movements across space, different practices. But we know that this is a human universal, this kind of recognition of death and using ritual to recognize that. So I think there's a lot in the anthropological toolkit, even though that's kind of a hokey term. There's a lot there. Part of it is seeing these universals, recognizing human sort of relationships and what we all share in common and that which is different. Of course, anthropology is very interested in difference, cultural difference, and different practices, but there are also things that we share. And so I think that anthropology is great on that count. I'll say one other small thing. Anthropology is also, it's not just the study of human beings or understanding how we human beings cooperate or don't with each other, but it is a kind of set of attentions. It's an attunement to attentions and to noticing. When I talk to undergraduates, I tell them that anthropology really is the art of noticing, and it's about noticing small details. It's about recognizing and appreciating those details, and then being able to communicate those to a wider audience. So I think that attentional capacity, that art of noticing, and then the recognition around rituals and other human practices all kind of feed into some of the qualities that we can learn from in anthropology.
Could I add one quick thing to that? Uh, another amazing thing, as Cymene was saying about anthropology, is it gives you this opportunity, this gift, really, to understand how many different thousands of ways of being human there are. There's not sort of one single human nature. There's all of these different ways that societies over time have figured out how we can live in this world together. Most of them haven't, sort of undermined their ecology in the way this society has. But part of that is one thing you learn that's really different about how we live is that we think of the essence of human life as really being focused on ourselves, on our individual selves. And it goes back to the Greek philosophers, know thyself, you know. But most human societies over time actually were much more interested in two other things other than themselves as individuals. They were interested in kinship, their relationships with their family, and they were interested in their relationship to land. So in a way, kinship and land and landscape are these really, again, powerful, almost human universals. And what one of the magical things about Time and Water is it's really a film about kin and land as much as it's a film about a person, right? And that's what's so incredible is you sort of gotten your way back to that deeper level of human universality, I think.
Thanks for that elaboration. And if we continue along that thread, that also gets us, you said you talked about kinship. We can also think about community, and particularly if you think about community and storytelling. Um, I want to come back to you a bit on that, Dominic, but maybe Sarah, can you talk a little bit more about some of the ways that you were struck in editing and this film and working with the footage that you had? What kinds of things did you learn about community and particularly storytelling through your experience there?
That's a great question, especially coming off of a discussion of kinship, because it was central to our vision for the film to structure the film in a way that showed the kinship between humans and glaciers. Specifically, we wanted to do that through the idea of memory. Um, Glaciers can be thought of as an archive of the planet. When ice is frozen, it traps the air, traps the dust, the volcanic ash, the earth. A bird could drop a feather, and at that very moment, it could be frozen. So I'll just say a glacier is a kind of time capsule of a specific moment that contains, planetary memory, so to speak. In Time and Water, very tragically, Andres Magnuson, our protagonist, his grandfather, Auroni, who was one of the first to explore and photograph Iceland's glaciers, he loses his own memory. And we were trying to not instrumentalize the devastation of memory loss by any means, but through juxtaposition, kind of weave this story of kind of the human memory and planetary memory at a time of loss. And by mapping kind of a human emotions onto the glaciers, we were hoping that that could show that interwoven kinship between ice and humans. So that was part of our kind of structuring of the film through the edit itself. The material we were largely working with also was archival. It was footage that Andre's grandparents had shot, and then Andre himself began to document his own life. I don't want to give away too much with the film for those of you who haven't seen it, but he began to really kind of capture everything that he loved through his own camera in an effort to really kind of stop time, which I think is something so many people can relate to, especially in moments of change. And so we tried to use that archival imagery to feel like memory in this kind of subjective, associative sense. And we thought by doing so, that could help to get at kind of the power of loss that we feel. But it really was this idea of kinship that was kind of guiding the whole way through and trying to show we are not separate from glaciers. We're not separate from any other beings. We're entangled, and it's that entanglement is really kind of where we tried to locate the film.
Yeah, that's beautiful, and I think the stories as well, both the viewing the storytelling as it's happening in the film, as well as Arne's Magnuson's experience in the archives and encountering these old folk tales and things like that. Allow this sort of interpenetration of time, which is quite remarkable. Dominic, can you elaborate a little bit in some of the ways you're thinking about community and storytelling?
Sure. I mean, I think, we've we felt and imparted through the glacier work, and imparted to some of the other projects we work on. We podcast, we're working on a TV show, we're doing a few different things. And in all those cases, I think, what you're trying to do ultimately is not only speak to somebody as, again, individual, but to actually, through media, try to build community. And I think media does that. Different media have different ways of doing it. But, there's a difference. And you're going to feel it if you go tomorrow at 11 a.m., which you should. You're going to feel differently about this movie watching it with another group of people in community, right? there's an intimacy to television that sits right in your bedroom that creates a sense of that's special about that messaging. And I think that, that is emotional. And sometimes what we really, prize in media and communication is the ability to give us a sense of warmth, a sense of community, to give us something to talk about with other people, as much as it is just like giving us information as solo folks. So I think it's something that's very much part of our thinking about how to do this, is about not just how to create a narrative, how to create characters, but also how to create something at the back end that's going to allow people to feel together differently than they might have if they hadn't had that media in their life.
So if we think about the film's production of community, both as us as viewers, but then its attention to the communities that exist there, one of the things that struck me most profoundly was the way in which there was an intergenerational claim that's happening. And it's a claim that's tied to place that's really powerful. And so it's not an abstract community, but it's something as not someone from Iceland, but someone from Canada and Texas, I'm looking at, and it profoundly works on me as a way of thinking about the intergenerational importance of storytelling. And I know you've thought about this, Cymene. Can you elaborate a little bit in some of the ways you're thinking about, or this film that prompted you to think about the intergenerational and storytelling together?
Yeah, thank you. And I know, Sarah, you've been thinking a lot and working with this idea too of intergenerational communication and action. I mean, one of the things that Andres Snær Magnuson loves to sort of point out to people is that we actually have people among us who will live into the future, into the time when there will no longer be glaciers in Iceland, for example, among many other things. So if you take a grandchild or a great niece or a great nephew, those are people who will be alive in many, many decades into the future. So when we begin to think intergenerationally, we can think several generations into the future through our own families or through our relationships with friends and others as kind of telling us a future that we haven't yet been able to experience. The thing about intergenerational thinking is I think it is really challenging for most of us to think into the long horizon of the future. We're not, as people, we're not really trained to think into the sort of deep time that glaciers live or the deep time that we need to imagine. But doing this through our own kinship networks, through our own sets of our own family relationships is one way to sort of imagine that intergenerational connection. There's some really interesting activist work going on too. We talked to some people who are doing, it's kind of a performance art piece that they've been performing in Europe and other places called the Intergenerational Court of Climate Crimes. And what they're doing is they're taking corporations and others to task, governments and corporations to task. I won't name names right here, but they're taking them to task around the kinds of harms that they've done to ecosystems, to environments, and they do it in this very sort of playful but also serious performative way. And I think it's interesting because as we think about intergenerational impacts and imagining ourselves into the future, I think each of us can also think of and do what we imagine to be useful work into the future. So it's not so much just thinking about one's legacy or what kind of, genealogy people will look back on about you as a person, but it's like acting every day in a way that will positively impact the future. So what can I do today, this day, and what can I do tomorrow, that day, and the day after that, that will have a positive impact upon the environment, upon human relationships, and I think just practicing those sorts of intentional exercises can be very useful just a small way. Maybe it's behavioral changes, maybe it's big political changes, maybe it's about doing works of art that are gonna make a difference. But if every day we commit ourselves to that, then every day is an opportunity to make a better future, not just for ourselves, but for all of our fellow human beings and the other creatures that we, share the biosphere with. And most of us are pretty good at taking care of our families and giving attention and love to our families. But all of us, I think, need to get better at giving care and attention and love to our environments and our ecosystems. There's a philosopher, an Australian philosopher called Albrecht, who talks about this idea of solastalgia. That's what he calls this sort of a memory, a lost memory of a place that's forever changed. And it's sort of a sad motif in a way, but it's a way of recognizing these environments that are changing and trying to preserve them in the way that we want them to be. So giving that care and love to environments, the same care and love that we give to our families, that would be one step towards getting us closer to intergenerational justice, towards intergenerational care.
Right. Sarah, did you come into this project with the intergenerational at the front? I mean, how central? I haven't read Magnuson's book, so maybe it's really central to that too. And so maybe it's a two-part question. So first of all, was that central? How did you come into it thinking about how generations were going to matter in the making of this film and this kind of storytelling? And then are there any sort of anecdotes you can tell about how that impressed upon you in the practice of working as a filmmaker?
Sure. Yeah. So Andre's book on time and water is this wonderfully expansive book that is about it's about the climate crisis. But it's also about his grandparents, not just his grandparents who explored the glaciers, but also his grandparents that lived kind of close to the sea and were involved in the eider duck feather harvest, which is working very collaboratively, so to speak, with eider duck to harvest their down. So he wove like kind of this multi-generational family story with so much science about oceans, about glaciers, as well as politics and the history of the crisis. But by kind of bringing in that family story, he provided this very emotional kind of current that coursed throughout the book. I loved the book very much, and at the same time, there was no way our film could ever be an adaptation of the book, given how expansive it is. But we really wanted it to feel kind of like a cinematic sibling, so to speak. And we wanted to use the footage that he had already captured. And luckily he had captured just beautiful and intimate and funny moments with his grandparents. So that was really exciting for us to work with. That worked for us visually, but also thematically. It was so important for us to tell this intergenerational story, specifically how it could kind of break us out of that thinking that time is bounded by an individual human's life. I really love what you were saying, Cymene, about kind of the expansiveness that can come with thinking about kind of our ancestors as well as what we project into the quote unquote emptiness of the future. And that was something that Andre wrote about beautifully, but also that did show up in his footage. Um, I think that there's a kind of pernicious technology of capitalism that really does entrain us into thinking that time equals one human lifespan. But when you have all of this footage that shows, no, there's this wingspan of time. I am not just me. I am my parents, my grandparents, my great grandparents. I am also my descendants, be they blood or chosen family, or again, kin of nature. I think that that causes like kind of a radical expansion of our own views. And that's like something that I feel like the film tries to gesture towards. It's that kind of expansive map of who we are, and thus can conjure a feeling of care for our the descendants we might never meet. So I'm kind of going all over the place, but I was really moved by how Andre captured that, not just in his words in his book, but also through his footage. And it was such a gift that we got to work with that imagery and those ideas in making Time and Water.
So I want to come back to emotion in a minute, but let me push you on this a little bit more because, I think we know these in a lot of cases. We can think about time, we can think about how intergenerations matter, how our grandparents might have experienced the world. But what's really remarkable about this film is how you've technically drawn us in to pause in that moment and truly understand it in these ways that sort of wash over you. And it's a really well, it's a profound experience. So if I can invite you to speak a little bit technically about like how did you think about cracking that open a little bit?
It was very challenging, but first I should say I worked with an amazing team. I have an incredible set of producers I worked with. I have brilliant editors that I worked with. We watched many, many, many hours of footage in order to kind of weave together these stories. Aaron Casper and Jocelyn Chaput, my editors who were on for the long haul of the film, they were particularly focused on kind of almost like these absurd details of joy and life. We were looking for moments that could really articulate the feeling of memory to kind of get at this kind of emotional power. And luckily, Andre and his kind of pretty much obsessive filming of his life gave us lots of goods to work with. So by putting kind of those moments to try to get at this feel of change, of life, of growth, of despair, that was really central to our editing process. Um, we also, though, wanted to complement this archival material with imagery of the glaciers themselves. We think of the whole film itself as as kind of a portal to this time where glaciers are alive. And when we're surrounded by messaging and a very scary reality that we might live soon in a world where there are no glaciers, it was really essential for us to create kind of an imaginary, so to speak, some sort of portal that really shows what still exists. And we did that. Our director of cinematography, Pablo Alvarez Mesa, is so particularly connected to kind of forces of water in his work. And I feel like through his eye was able to kind of capture this present day footage of glaciers that could speak to the archival material that we were working with to try to create kind of a polytemporal film, so to speak. So that was really a goal in the edit, was trying to weave in kind of glaciers from the past through Andre's grandparents' footage, glaciers of the present through our original shooting, and kind of these human lives coursing through it that all had their own kind of personal as well as cultural attachments to this world that very sadly is slipping away, but it's not yet gone. So I don't know if I quite answered your question.
Oh, that's great. I want a full master class in filmmaking from you. But I mean, let's actually stick with the techniques. I think we're all storytellers in one degree or another in this room, hopefully. How does emotion work with storytelling? Dominic, can you open this up for us a little bit?
Sure. I think I would go so far as to say you can't do good storytelling without emotion, right? I think a story for a story to really land, for it to connect with somebody, for it to agitate and move them and make them think, it has to hit them at an emotional level at some and then the question is how to do it, right? And there are different ways. I talked earlier about genre a little bit. You can make people laugh, you can make people cry, you can scare people. And I think actually something I've come to feel like is a lot of climate communication going all the way back to An Inconvenient Truth and films like that is kind of a genre of horror without actually acknowledging that it's doing horror work. So I'm like, if you want to do horror, great. This is like the golden age of horror. Do great horror, right? Lean into that. Like make somebody really scared and unsettled. That's another way of sort of connecting with people viscerally. But again, as somebody was saying, intentionally at the same time. So for me, and I think in our work, we know that we're not telling a story in a way that's going to matter unless we can figure out a way to make people feel something about it. And I think that's always been the litmus we've used for our own work too, is like, is this something that has a capacity to move people?
Does anyone want to elaborate on that anymore? Continue with the thread on emotion and storytelling.
Sure, yeah, I wholeheartedly agree. I think for me personally, the films I connect to most are the ones where there is emotion, where I can feel for the central characters in what I'm watching, and also bring my own experience to be in dialogue with what I'm witnessing. That's something in Time and Water, we were really trying to think, how can we make a glacier feel emotional? And as Cymene said, very few humans in the grand scheme of things will ever meet a glacier. So how can we make this seemingly abstract landscape feel personal, feel emotional, and thus you understand what's at stake when we talk about losing glaciers? And again, that's why weaving kind of this human story with the story of glaciers was so essential to the storytelling that we were working with. We didn't want to overly center humans, though. We didn't want it to all of a sudden become like it's all about us. But again, that's where we really saw the film as being situated through this idea of entanglement, but hopefully emotional. I'll just say that was very key to us as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that the film does so spectacularly well is it allows us to identify with these landscapes and glaciers as non-living entities that are real protagonists in the film, along with Andre and his family and these other human protagonists who we really connect with. And I think that the forms that you've been working in, Sarah, this documentary form is a really, really timely form. And here's my theory for why. Because we have been now exposed to quote unquote reality television for several decades now. And people continue to love it as a kind of a trope or a genre for television. And with the internet and social media, now we have an enhanced capacity to see real, regular people doing their regular things on TikTok and Reels and all of the little videos that we all obsessively watch. And so clearly, we love to watch real people doing things, sometimes weird things, sometimes fun things, but this connecting with real stories. Not that I have anything against fiction. I love fiction too, but I think connecting with these real stories can make a difference. I read a statistic a couple of weeks ago that in the United States, 90% of counties in the country have had an extreme weather disaster of one kind or another, 90%. So, what that means is that we are all getting exposed to these effects of the climate crisis. We're all getting exposed to major weather events and catastrophes and floods and fires and superstorms and et cetera. We're all feeling it. We're all having these experiences. So, what happens when we tell those stories? Because each of us are going to be having them more and more. People we know have had these experiences. So, these are real stories with real deep emotions in them. And it's about sort of narrating how that comes to be in the world and also how we can prevent future crisis around that. So again, I think like the documentary form is also really special, and that's something I love about the film as well.
So we're sort of getting towards the end, and I want to open up. I do have sort of one big question I want to ask as well. But before I ask that, are there things that we're missing here? Things you want to add to this conversation? We're covering storytelling. We've talked a bit about genre, emotion, the intergenerational, anthropology's role in this. What are we missing here? What else can we add to this conversation? That
I think one thing that immediately comes to mind for me, you use the word nostalgia, and that's a neologism. It's a new word that's kind of been created for these new times. And I just kind of want to call in the specificity of language and kind of the need for new languages and expansive stories that can speak to a moment that feels unprecedented. And so I just kind of wanted to mention that since you brought it up. And in relation to that, I really just want to come back to the ceremony that you both created, the funeral for Okioko, because that was, in a way, creating new language around these myriad losses that we're experiencing. I really do feel like it helps to articulate a way of mourning, of kind of, that there's the term disenfranchised grief, which I think about quite often. And it's a type of grief that it's not necessarily mourned socially. It's not an institutionalized, codified kind of grief. And so it can feel all the more nebulous when you experience a kind of loss or grief where you don't mourn publicly. And I feel like what you gave, not just Okioko, but now, I mean, there's so many funerals for glaciers around the world. The plaque that Andre writes has traveled so far. Like it to me, that feels like you gave this kind of new language for these new times. And so I just also wanted to say thank you for that. Kind of as I talk about kind of new words, new language.
Thank you. Dominic, you want to
Well,
say?
I'll just say just a little story. It's within a story. When we sort of first came up with this idea for doing a funeral for a glacier, which at that point hadn't been done. Subsequently, there've been a number of them, but we were a little nervous that people in Iceland would think this was sort of frivolous or even poking fun at something that was not to be poked fun at. And so we talked to the pastor of the largest church in the whole country of Iceland, and we interviewed him for the film. And he said something wonderful when he said, "Is this, does this sound like a crazy idea to you?" And he was really serious and said, "No. A funeral for a glacier is really meaningful for people who feel that the loss of a glacier is a real loss." And then he said something else that has stayed with us ever since, which is, funerals aren't for the dead people, right? They're for the living. They're for the living to kind of find the courage and the inner strength to keep going, even though there's been loss. And I think those are the times we're living in. We're not living in times of theoretical loss anymore. We're living in times of real loss, and real loss that can have massive impacts. It's true, most of the world will never see or touch a glacier, but billions of people rely on the water from glacially fed rivers. There are ways in which glaciers do touch all of us, also in the form of sea level rise. I mean, not a big issue in Austin, but in Houston, it's something we have to keep an eye on, right? Elsewhere along the coast and in New Orleans, even more so. So, there are ways that these kinds of stories and rituals, I think, can bring abstract ideas back to a place where we could really connect with them and get motivated to do something about them. If I tell you Iceland's losing 11 billion tons of ice a year, it doesn't mean, what does that mean? There's no analogy that would make sense to you, but you've all been to a funeral, right? Every one of you knows what it's like to lose somebody, and we'll all lose people in the course of our lives who mean something to us. And that's, I think, what this pivot is. And I feel like what Sarah's doing, what we're trying to do, Craig has been very modest. Craig does amazing work in this area too, through different media. I think all of those efforts are attempts to kind of bring these problems down to a human scale where we can actually understand and empathize and act on them.
I feel like we should end there. That's pretty perfect. Thank you. um, I do want to see if anyone's got any questions, but let me push one more thing here. We're all anthropologists up here, and one of our favorite uh, tools in the toolkit, as you said, Cymene, is looking other places, looking around the world for ways to shake up our habits of thinking and habits of seeing the world. And so I'm wondering if and this is a broad open question to all of you, is what are you seeing in non-Western places and non-Anglophone places in the global South? What other kinds of storytelling practices are emerging to get us through these very challenging times? And if you have any anecdotes, can you share them?
Do you want to answer that question, Craig? I kind of want to turn it back to you. I mean, you don't have to, but
That's a great question. I mean, I actually met a performance artist from Denmark a couple of years ago who is a bat ambassador. This isn't the global South, but she had come to Austin to do a series of performances and do research and ritual and brought people together. It was a really remarkable event that I know impressed people because I ran into someone a couple weeks ago who I didn't recognize. They're like, "Hey, I saw you at that bat thing that we saw. It was really weird and amazing." And I'm still thinking about what's going on with bats and the different diseases that they're getting that are being made more dire because of climate change. And so that was, I guess, yeah, not in the global South, but that's a nice anecdote from me.
I mean, I think one of the things that we learned in our research before we began doing the work in Iceland, we were doing work in Oaxaca, Mexico, which is an amazing place. Anyone who's been there would, I think, probably agree with that. And in that work, we were working with Beniasa people, also known as Zapotec people, who live in this region of Mexico, which is the most indigenous part of Mexico, the state of Oaxaca. And we were working on the development of wind parks and seeing the cultural impacts, the social impacts that wind parks and wind farms were having in the region, because it's the densest concentration of wind parks anywhere on Earth is in the Isthmus of Tehuantepec in Oaxaca, Mexico. So we were interested as anthropologists about the social impacts, the cultural impacts, the environmental impacts. And one of the things we learned from people there was an incredible appreciation for the wind that blows across this region And so while we were there to study infrastructure and development and change and economic and social transformation, what we also came away with was for a deep appreciation for the wind. And we learned that from Beniza people who had several different terms for the wind that blows through their region. A wind that is so strong that at times it blows over 18-wheel semi-trucks. At certain months during the year, it will blow over these trucks. But there's also a cooling, beautiful wind that's soothing, that cools the heat of the day, that is called Beniza. And so I think there are ways of kind of understanding the quote unquote natural world environments in ways that we're not always accessing as we're going about our usual living here in this world of pernicious technologies of capitalism. I love that. So I think there's a lot to learn from other people's outside of the industrialized world, but also to get an appreciation for these different kinds of cosmologies that are available to us if we're able to listen and able to take them in.
Thank you. Well, I gather that we have the opportunity to play the clip again. So for anyone who came in and didn't see the clip beforehand, I think we're going to play that. I really encourage you to go out tomorrow at the Austin Film Society, AFS, 11 a.m. The film will be screening, and afterwards there will be a Q&A with Sarah and Shane Boris. So what was Shane's role?
Shane is a producer of the film.
Right. So is there any last words you want to share before we wrap things up?
I just want to say thank you. I'm so inspired to be in conversation with you all. It means so much to me personally. I feel like I'm learning so much. I'm also hungrily thinking like, oh, I want to weave this into kind of how we talk about the film. But it reminds me that I think for me personally, a film is just a beginning. It's a real starting place for continual conversations. I feel like right now we're adding another layer to the film through this conversation, and I hope this will go on to do some meaningful work in the world. But I also hope we can continue to be in conversation, all of us, because the work that you did, it really did. It's what launched the film, so to speak. You created the ceremony that kicked it all off, and I also I think that. Yeah, I feel like maybe you should say kind of what the plaque has done, the plaque for Okiopol around the world. I feel like it's really become kind of a model for grieving in these hard times. I don't, yeah, if that's something you want to share.
Thank you, Sarah. Were you going to say something? Well, everyone, please join me in thanking Sarah Dosa, Dominic Boyer, and Cymene Howe.